Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Richard Nephew, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia SIPA. Thank you for joining us again this week for another special briefing co-hosted by the Center and the Institute of Global Politics at SIPA. Today's briefing is part of an ongoing series co-hosted by IGP and CGEP on the evolving dynamics of the Israel-Iran conflict. Our panelists this afternoon will focus a bit more specifically than our last conversation on the energy impacts of the conflict and how the attacks over the weekend on Iran's nuclear facilities, as well as retaliation against U.S. military targets in the Gulf earlier this week, have impacted the global oil and gas markets and the world's energy economy. Additionally, as the ceasefire brokered by the Trump administration remains in place, we will also touch a bit more broadly today on the current geopolitical state of the world and how things may have changed since the conflict began now almost 2 weeks ago. With that, I'm happy to be joined this afternoon by John Feiner, an Institute of Global Politics Carnegie Distinguished Fellow and CGEP Distinguished Visiting Fellow, and a former Principal Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House. Jason Bordoff, the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia University's SIPA, a former White House National Security Council energy advisor, and a known expert on the geopolitics of the energy transition. Karen Young, a senior research scholar here at the Center and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where she focuses on the political economy of the Gulf states and energy policy. And Daniel Sternoff, a non-resident fellow at the Center and head of Energy Aspects Executive Briefing Service. So we've got a lot to get through. So before I hand it over to John Feiner to give us some opening framing remarks on the current situation as a whole, but remind everyone to please use the Q&A function to submit questions for our panelists to cover during our conversation. I should also note that John has to drop off a little bit early, so if you have any John-specific questions, please start putting them in the Q&A now. With that, John, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Richard, and great to be here with you and others on the screen, and thanks everybody for joining. I will just start by saying this is the kind of prelude to the real experts, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where things are in the broader conflict, and I'm going to do that with a degree of humility because, to be honest, I didn't expect us to be in this place, even as recently as a month or so ago. I thought this was headed in a very different direction, so I want to be upfront about that. But I will tell you a little bit about what I think has happened up till now, where I think that leaves us in the current moment, and where this could head before we turn it over to people who know a lot more about the core topic of today. So first off, I think we have to start by acknowledging what an extraordinary operational and tactical success this has been for the United States and Israel, and what a kind of humiliating and pretty devastating setback this has been for Iran. And there are significant caveats to everything I just said, but I think it's important to start there. Richard, I know you were part of some of this. Jason, you may have been too, but I spent a lot of time in the Situation Room gaming out how an attack on Iran might go, what that might look like. Not because we relish doing it or anything like that. In fact, very much for the opposite reason. We were very much hoping to avoid it, but knew we had to be prepared for the possibility that we might have to do this. And in all of the scenarios we looked at, the outcome was significantly worse than what has happened over the last couple of weeks. The prospect of almost certainly losing an aircraft or two on either the U.S. side or the Israeli side, the prospect of significant casualties in Israel and in the United States. We used to talk in terms of hundreds, if not more, casualties from an Iranian retaliation against Israel and against our bases. And so, why did we end up? Why did this end up going better? I think the one big reason is that a lot of the risk associated with this operation was bought down over the course of the last year, primarily by Israel really having dealt devastating blows to Iran's deterrent. The main one being Hezbollah. What we were most worried about was the ability of Hezbollah to sort of ravage Israeli cities with rockets if they ever attacked Iran. And one of the most interesting things that happened after the Israeli strikes began is Hezbollah came out and said, we are not getting into this unless we get attacked. And Israel then had no reason or need to attack Hezbollah, having dealt with that in 2024. Israel also took out a significant number of Iran's air defenses over the course of 2024 after Iran took a bunch of shots at Israel in the sort of post-October 7th period. So the risk went way down. The U.S. and Israel were ready. We actually drilled for the first time together with the Israelis what an attack on Iran might look like. You can go back and look this up. There was like a press release about it in 2024, partly to signal to the Iranians that, by the way, this could happen. So, don't mess with us, piece of our deterrence, and partly to be ready for exactly this kind of scenario if we ended up there. So the U.S. and Israel were ready. It went extremely well operationally. The right targets were hit. But that's not the whole story. And so the question is, where does this leave us now? That in some ways is the good news. And, as others can attest, that was always the part of this that, while it was high risk, was the easy part in some way. Actually, putting bombs on the right targets and getting out of that. The question now, though, is how much has the strategic challenge for Israel and the U.S. changed? And I think you can make a pretty strong argument that while Iran has been dealt a blow, the basic challenge that we face has not changed all that much. Iran's nuclear program, whether it's been set back a number of months, as some reports say, or a year, or even a few years, is not durably locked down in the way that really, in our view, my view at least, you can only lock down through a diplomatic deal. The JCPOA, which President Obama reached, was a 10 or 15-year deal to lock down Iran's nuclear program. Nobody is saying that this military option took out Iran's nuclear program for that long, even the most optimistic scenarios. That's one. So they still need a deal. They needed a deal a month ago. They still need one. Two, we have lost a lot of insight into exactly what is going on with Iran's nuclear program, partly because it's buried under a bunch of rubble, and partly because the inspectors who were sitting on site, staring at centrifuges, staring at enriched material until a few weeks ago, are obviously no longer doing that. And there's no prospect of them getting back into those locations soon unless there is some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. So yes, we will gather intelligence. Yes, we will do overhead imagery analysis and try to pick up what the Iranians are saying to each other about the state of play, but none of that will be as certain as having experts physically present on site, which we had up till now. So bottom line, we're a little less certain. We still need a diplomatic deal. And then the big debate is Iran more or less incentivized to actually pursue a weapon than they were? I can make both arguments. I can make the case that having been bombed, they probably don't want to get bombed again, at least not anytime soon. I can also make the case that having been bombed, they look at other countries that have nuclear weapons and see, not coincidentally, they don't tend to get attacked the way Iran just did. So that is a high stakes question that we don't know the answer to. What happens now? And then I will wrap up. I think we will end up back in talks. Trump keeps saying that. You can see why the Iranians might want that, if only because it's a little harder to keep bombing them, although not impossible, as we've seen, if they are actually in diplomatic negotiations. But I think the prospects of these talks are very challenging because the core issue in the talks remains, I think, a red line, both for the Iranians and for the U.S., which are irreconcilable. And that is, can Iran enrich uranium on its own territory? The Iranians say that is kind of the sine qua non of a deal. Trump, I think, initially indicated he was comfortable with that and then pulled that back during the course of the talks for a whole range of reasons. I think if one side or the other concedes on that, we could end up with a deal. I think the likelihood of either side conceding on that, even Iran having been, really set back, is pretty low. I think the Iranians probably would rather get bombed again than give that up in the near term. But that's a subjective question. And so over the medium term, I think we end up more or less where we are now, maybe with some additional diplomatic conversations, maybe with some ceasefire violations on each side that could potentially risk flaring this whole situation up again. And then the three things that we are going to watch for, that would be the biggest game changers are: one, does Iran actually try to break out and get a weapon? Can debate the wisdom of that or the outcome of that, but that could lead to proliferation of weapons in the region. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other countries wanting them. Two, does something happen to the Iranian regime that would be a game changer? Either a coup of some kind, a collapse of some kind, a popular uprising. We will be the last, I suspect, we, the United States and our intelligence community, to predict that. We don't tend to be very good at foreseeing these things, but that could happen. That would be a game changer. And then three, the last game changer would be some sort of Iranian retaliation that's asymmetric. And the thing here I worry about the most is targeted assassinations, which they have tried to do in the past, largely unsuccessfully. The one data point on this is when Trump attacked Qasem Soleimani in 2019, 2020, killed the senior most official in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force. Iran shot some ballistic missiles and then said it was over. So we thought that was all wrapped up. The reality was, which we disclosed in the Biden administration, Iran started plotting to try to assassinate senior U.S. officials who were involved in that strike. They hadn't succeeded, but they certainly intended to and want to. And you can imagine them saying, even though there's a ceasefire now, what are some other ways that are maybe a little more deniable than a ballistic missile attack that we could try to hurt Israel, hurt the U.S.? And so we got to be watching for that too. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks very much, John. Really appreciate those comments, and I agree with the vast majority of them. I think the places where we don't are places where we don't know the answer, to be honest. And I think that's where I would just offer a couple brief observations. I couldn't agree more. This isn't over yet. There are some folks who are kind of making the assertion, well, we've done this, so now we can kind of sit down and take a breather. Not in the slightest. I mean, first of all, we've got ceasefire terms that are incredibly indistinct. We don't know what actually constitutes a violation of the ceasefire. Is nuclear reconstitution a violation of the ceasefire, or is it just active hostilities? That's important if we start to see the Iranians start moving in that sort of direction. And so, what our commitment is to enforce the ceasefire and what it looks like if there's a breach, I think is important. I think there's huge differences that exist, and the public debate on this is really getting, frankly, irritating, between damage that was done to the nuclear program, which was quite considerable, and whether or not breakout as a risk has been eliminated. Those are two completely different things. And you can say that the program was extensively damaged while saying there's still a risk of breakout. And as you pointed to, we don't have the same level of access that we have with the IAEA. In fact, that's getting worse. Just earlier today, the Guardian Council has ratified the decision by the Parliament to end cooperation with the IAEA, or at least suspend it, contingent on other things happening. And when you add to that Iran has every incentive in the world to reconstitute the program in deeper, hidden, buried places, which are harder to hit, harder to inspect, where we don't have that insight, it's really hard to look at this and say, okay, mission accomplished here. And I think that'd be my last observation is, we need to accept that this is a risk rather than a perfect success. When we undertook military action, we closed a chapter, but we did not close the book. And if we start to believe that we should have, everything's done, everything's perfect, it's going to blind us to being able to see, any attempts by the Iranians to reconstitute, which frankly would undermine the achievements that were made in the military operation. So, as we look forward to what comes next, and I agree with you, a deal is the most durable way of addressing this problem rather than additional military action. We have to stay pretty vigilant to see what the Iranians are going to do next and what we want to do in response to all that. But this conversation is intended to focus a lot more on the energy market aspect of it. So let's do that, pivot now and talk a little bit more about the current state of oil markets, energy markets, and how things are looking today. No one better to do that than Daniel. So over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Maybe let me begin by saying that for the last 2 decades, if you would have named the single largest geopolitical risk to oil supply in the Middle East, it would have involved some scenario around unilateral military strikes on Iran's nuclear program and around the choke point that is the Strait of Hormuz. And if you spent the last 2 weeks in a fortified bunker, you would think absolutely nothing had happened because oil prices are basically flat from where they were at the outset of this crisis. We've had a big round trip in prices. We're now trading about $68 a barrel on Brent, $65 on WTI, just $1 or $2 higher than where we were two weeks ago. We still learned quite a lot, and this was a big shocks that were avoided for the oil market. We began this week on Monday. We came in with Brent trading at the highs of this conflict at $81.40 a barrel. Right after, over the weekend, we had the strikes by the U.S. on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. We had probably about a $14 premium baked into the oil price. And the market was wondering how Iran would respond and whether it would make good on threats to take some action in the Strait of Hormuz. And obviously in the earlier phases of this conflict, energy infrastructure had been targeted. So Iran had hit an oil refinery in Haifa, basically shutting it down. The Israelis had struck a gas processing platform in Iran and South Pars. These caused localized impacts, but nothing that impacted global markets. And so fears were obviously very high coming into this week that we could see an escalation that would impact energy supplies. What was amazing about Monday in the oil market is the second that we saw missiles being fired from Iran to the U.S. airbase in Qatar, which seemed to have some advance notice because U.S. personnel were already moving to shelter in place. The market began to sell off. We had a $10 sell-off over the course of a few hours. Basically, the market concluded that Iran was carrying out some symbolic strikes similar to what it did after the killing of Qasem Soleimani a few years ago, token strikes on a U.S. facility. And the market was really quick to its judgment that says, okay, Iran isn't going to touch Hormuz. This is de-escalatory. There's no appetite here. And basically, all of the risk premium completely evaporated. And I think speaking with a lot of traders in the oil market this week, I mean, I think many are concluding that there will be changes in the way the market moves to price geopolitical risk in the future. If we could come through a crisis of this magnitude and not see any kind of an actual disruption, we learned there's really a taboo around impacting oil supply to the global market. That is from Iran's perspective. It would cut off its nose to spite its face. If it hurt one of its few friends and largest customer, which is China, it would hurt its own energy exports. It would invite retaliation from the US. We also learned that the Israelis did not want to cut off Iran's oil export platforms, which would have great advantages from an Israeli perspective, but which could have the whole world blaming it for causing triple-digit oil prices. So basically, no one wanted to touch this, and I think the toxicity of interfering with those flows is going to be internalized by oil markets and might dampen future assessments of geopolitical risk. Or what we really need to see are actual disruptions to physical supply to have really meaningful pricing into the consequences. I would just like to add, this does not mean that oil markets can fade geopolitical risk at all. Obviously, as you and John both mentioned, this is not over. I think the context also matters. The context for this crisis was OPEC Plus had fortunately been unwinding production cuts at an accelerated rate since April. So there was more oil coming into the market. We've had demand fears caused by US tariffs and associated declines in global trade. We've got a lot of OPEC spare capacity. So those conditions obviously created some cushion. But this also isn't over. There are a few risks going forward. Some of what you were discussing around will we see regime change or internal, will this conflict flare up again? Those all open up a whole host of medium-term risks that can still impact oil supply. Let me just make a couple of quick risks more on the near term that are relevant, and then hand it back. One is what will happen with Iranian oil sanctions from here? Will they be tightened or will they be loosened? Trump has kind of signaled now China can continue to import oil from Iran. Now, China never stopped importing oil from Iran, so it's not clear what he meant. If there's going to be a loosening of enforcement of oil sanctions, that could bring more Iranian oil into the market, when it will have to cope with big OPEC volumes that will be hitting the market later this year. Will they be tightened if you need to have leverage to try to bring Iran into negotiations over a more durable deal? These are really big swings in global flows, and I think the oil market has to pay attention to that. I think another one will be if Iran is hunkering down and will try to reconstitute its program. At some point, you can ask whether the Israelis will conclude that it makes sense to allow Iran to continue to export 1.5 million barrels per day to China to earn those revenues in order to fund that reconstitution that might be less visible than it is now. So yes, this phase may be done, but the war is definitely not over, nor are the oil market consequences.
Thanks, Daniel. I have to say, our internal Slack channel, when you posted that oil was being sold off, I can still visualize my reaction was deep incredulity, and I really do imagine it's a remarkable, kind of turn of events and how folks were looking at this outside. Because frankly, at the moment, we didn't know, which I think is basically what I said to you. But Karen, you're tracking the GCC reaction to this crisis, and also the evolving relationship between the major GCC powers in the U.S. as well as with Israel. I think we agree that the GCC didn't see this as so token, and presumably the broader conflict has really affected their thinking too. So, are their leaders in Saudi Arabia and UAE relieved that this wasn't worse, or do they in fact see this as a significant setback for their security and economic interests? And what's that going to make them, try and do?
Well, thank you, Richard. It's good to be with you all. Yeah, I think for the Gulf Cooperation Council states, these are the 6 states that sit on the Arabian Peninsula, then plus Yemen outside of that. This is the most extreme threat, the thing they fear the most of seeing missiles flying over their territory. And a direct attack from Iran. It has happened before. Remember we had the 2019 missile and drone attacks that were on the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, which came ostensibly from Iran, but not attributed. And then, of course, we've had Houthi attacks from Yemen into UAE territory as recently as 2022. And in both of those cases, the Gulf states felt like the U.S. was not adequately sensitive to their threat perception and to their risk. And again, I think that is happening. Qatar sort of stood in front of the train in this case. They really made the decision, I suppose, very carefully and in coordination perhaps with the United States and some conversation and advance warning from Iran that the retaliation would happen against the U.S. base at Al Udeid. And they did not respond. And that is really a sign I think we're seeing now of GCC unity. We've seen the president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, going to Qatar yesterday to show support to the emir. And it's not always been that way. So I think this period right now for the Gulf states is one where they see the region in fragmentation. They are growing their resources to be able to be a source of global intervention, certainly in energy markets, but also as investors in many other spaces. But they are not ready to take on the reconfiguration or reconstruction of Iran or other parts of the region. This is different than an approach they took after the Arab Spring. So from about 2011 to 2018, we saw very interventionist foreign policies, particularly from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and also from Qatar, in places like Egypt or Yemen, or even in Ethiopia and Sudan. They don't really want to do that anymore. The focus is on national economic transformation, really focusing on domestic economies, on their diversification away from dependency on oil and gas revenues, and becoming a hub to the world and a hub to emerging markets as investors in renewable energy, in artificial intelligence. That's the image they want to present to the world, and it's not an image that's consistent with missiles flying over, the skies of Doha. And so it is a huge threat. The other thing that I think makes the Gulf states very uncomfortable right now is the ascendancy of Israel. So Israel has shown itself to be a masterful military force in the region. It's been simultaneously, launching attacks into Lebanon against Hezbollah, into Syria and seizing territory in Syria, and of course the war in Gaza, and now the attacks on Iran. That feels a little bit out of control. And even though the states, Bahrain and UAE, that have normalized ties with Israel, there is a sense that the United States is the only force that can contain, constrain, influence the choices of Israel in the region. And so I think that's what we're going to see pressure sort of mounting now, negotiations, the Gulf states really asking for more mediation and consideration of their concerns, and some bargaining, willing to make concessions, perhaps on normalization, perhaps on the Gaza issue, on a Palestinian state, which just really, I think, underscore the fact that they want to see stability and are willing to do what they can to achieve that, minus doing a major intervention of their own.
Great, thanks. It's interesting when we think about the Abraham Accords and we think about some of the movements towards more kind of regional rapprochement. I think that the sense is that things are all moving in a positive sort of direction. But I think part of that was on the basis of an understanding of what the security environment looked in the region, what the political environment looked like. I think you're right. I think that has been challenged now, and there are some open questions here. And I actually wonder too, this is a general thought that we can maybe talk about later. Right now, the U.S. and Israel are presenting this as we worked really closely together, and we in fact did, and that we've gamed this out, as John was saying. I mean, all this stuff is very positive. There are definitely points of tension in that relationship. It's notable to me that the president of the United States announced a ceasefire, and it wasn't clear that Israel was ready to do that yet, especially with some of their comments there too. So I think some of these points, not to mention his press conference on the way to the helicopter, are indicative of some tensions that I think are going to emerge both U.S.-Israel or region-wide and so forth. But let's take another half step back out into the discussion about the global economy and the global energy markets in particular. So Jason, again, as we were kind of talking about with Daniel a little bit, I think there's been some assumptions buried in to what would happen if you would have a conflict across the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. There seems to be an assumption by some that given the state of the energy market impact earlier this week and oil prices today, it's going to stay a regionally focused conflict without broader global impact. How true is that? How do you look at global economic and energy market implications here?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I wish I could. I kind of want to just not say anything and listen to the four of you because that was a really fascinating discussion. So thanks for that. I don't want to repeat some of what has been said. Daniel knows so much about this, as do Karen and John. But as Daniel said, this what we saw in the last 2 to 3 weeks was sort of the mother of all geopolitical risks that the oil market would have been concerned about. And it is striking that, yes, oil prices surged from the high 60s to at their peak 80 or 81, but not triple digits, not $120, $150 a barrel. I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, John was dealing with prices like 140 or so. There's nowhere close to that level. And a couple of reasons for that. I mean, partly it's just the fundamentals in the oil market. We've seen this enormous growth in supply, notably from shale oil production. Demand growth this year has been revised downward a bit because of some macroeconomic headwinds, including because of the trade policies this country is putting in place. OPEC has been bringing barrels back to the market faster than had been expected. So I think Daniel would agree that the consensus view is supply growth this year will exceed demand growth this year, and that's sort of the macro backdrop in which this all takes place. But as he said, there's just generally been this trend where since the 1970s, since the Arab oil embargo, for decade after decade, we've been talking about geopolitical risk to supply in the Middle East and elsewhere, and we just rarely see it. And so I think over time, the geopolitical risk premium starts to erode because people in the energy markets discount the probability that supply really will be disrupted. This was true when Russia invaded Ukraine and weaponized their dominant position for gas supply to Europe, but oil supply was not disrupted, even though prices spiked in response to the outbreak of that conflict. So now I do think I'm curious to get Daniel's take on this too when we come back to questions. Whether that it holds true in the future is an interesting question, right? I mean, before prices spiked, and as Daniel said, we're back to where they were before, you had a bunch of people in the U.S. oil industry, and I think even the EIA's own projections now are a slight decline, maybe flat, maybe a slight growth. But the days of 1 million, 1.5 million barrels per day per year of U.S. production growth are kind of over. So that enormous increase to global supply isn't there. OPEC spare capacity, there's some of that, but it's not unlimited, especially as you bring the voluntary cut barrels back to the market faster. The buffer we have to deal with shocks has been eroded. The SPR is roughly half the size it was when, Richard, you and I served in the Obama administration, and that's because both parties sold off oil to pay for other things in Congress. The Biden administration did an enormous release in response to Russia invading Ukraine, even though, again, Russian supply wasn't disrupted. So we lost a meaningful amount of that buffer. So there's a little less to work with, and the question is whether circumstances in the future could evolve in a way that we start to really see escalation, which, to your point, you made a comment, this is not over yet. Oil markets seem to think it's over, and that's why prices have retraced to roughly where they were before. But that could all turn around if we see the stocks of the highly enriched uranium are still there. Israel says we got to go do something about that. I mean, there's a deal doesn't work out, a whole set of things that could happen. I think what's interesting is how much of a risk that poses to the oil market. And I'm just echoing a little bit or elaborating on what Daniel said, because for all the talk of risk to oil supply, it didn't materialize. It wasn't a weapon or a tool that was used. Mining the Strait of Hormuz, attacking oil infrastructure like Abqaiq, either in Iranian retaliation or the original strike to go over a place like Kharg Island in Iran. No one went there. And it's partly because it's such a blunt instrument now. Like, again, going back to history, in the early 1970s, you could impose an embargo. Oil was traded in long-term contracts between buyer and seller. You didn't have the deeply interconnected, integrated global oil market that we do today. So if you try to weaponize oil, you're imposing pain on yourself, you're imposing pain on your allies, as well as maybe on your adversaries. It's harder to target than it was, for example, for Russia to cut off gas supply to Europe, which was a bit more targeted, and there was less revenue for Russia as a result of that. So the gas market is somewhat globalized, but not nearly to the same extent as oil is. And I think that's interesting because we're in this moment now of geoeconomic fragmentation and geopolitical competition. Energy security as a dominant focus of energy policy has sort of returned to the fore. We spent an enormous amount of time, as we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. We should spend more time talking about climate change as an important, urgent policy priority. But we kind of became a little complacent with energy security over the last 10 or 15 years, at least in advanced economies, and took it for granted to some extent. And I think it is back at the top of the agenda because we've seen high prices, because electricity demand is rising, and we need to win this competitive race for AI leadership with China. And so we're talking more about energy security. And I think there will be an impulse to say, in this world of great power competition and fragmentation, security comes from disconnecting. Security comes from reducing trade, making everything at home, being energy independent. And I think the comment about actually we didn't go there because we're so interconnected is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Where does security actually come from? And do you enhance security by making more interconnection, not disconnecting in a global market? And come back to that. And the last point to say, maybe related to that, because when you are in an interconnected global market, it also means that a disruption halfway around the world affects you, whether you're an importer or an exporter. And so if you go back to 2020, when the assassination of Soleimani happened, I remember Trump commenting afterwards. He just said something like, we're oil independent now, so we don't really care what happens in the Middle East. And that was never true for either side of the aisle. And this is a reminder of that. Trump took to Truth Social to say, keep oil prices down, we're watching, told the Energy Department to drill more, even though the government doesn't sort of do the drilling. But the point is, he was deeply concerned about oil prices, notwithstanding the fact that the US has gone from importing 60% of its oil to being a net exporter. It's still an interconnected market. You're still vulnerable to global volatility. And I would just make the point that it was striking to me a little bit of a dissonance. The next day, he took to Truth Social to sort of praise what members of Congress are doing to try to pull back on many of the tax credits to support things like electric vehicles. And the best thing you can do to increase your energy security is reduce how much oil you use in the first place. Not just for climate reasons, although I think that's important, but actually to reduce the oil intensity of your economy, because in an interconnected market, again, prices are going to spike whether you're producing everything or not. So I do think a takeaway from this would be the need to continue to focus on things like energy efficiency and reducing oil consumption for reasons of security, not just reasons of the climate agenda.
Oh, great, thanks for that. In fact, one of the things that I was going to bring up, but you spoke to it well, is if the market loses its sense of risk and then something really bad happens, it seems to me the overshoot problem that comes along with that is pretty dramatic too. And this goes, we got a question in the chat, which I'll kind of preempt and hit from our old pal Rory, asking about whether or not Israel will be able to hold down the Iranian nuclear program by mowing the lawn and similar. again, this mow the lawn concept is kind of the idea that you just have repeated, military strikes against Iran to keep its nuclear program down. I've always questioned the fundamental logic of that. Okay, you do it once, you do it twice, you do it 3 times. At some point, are the Iranians in a position to retaliate and respond? And they may not be able to, mount a serious missile attack back on Israel after the damage that's been done. The Strait is right there now. Of course, military action can be taken to address that problem too. But it strikes me that part of the reason why we are in the almost privileged position we have now is because of Iranian restraint. That they were concerned about the risks of blowback, that they were more conservative and all that. If Iran changes its tactics, or if its leadership changes, that potentially makes that a heck of a lot more risky kind of scenario here too. I wanted to go to John.
Richard, can I?
Yeah,
oh, sorry. One more comment on the mowing the lawn, which is a idiom I can't stand for a range of reasons. Not blaming Rory for this; it's commonly used. One, these are bombs dropped on people, and not all of those bombs kill people who have anything to do with this conflict. And it's worth just keeping that in mind when we talk about this as sort of maintenance. It's a lot more than that. But two, whether or not they reconstitute their air defenses, Iran does, because that was a part of Rory's question as well. Flying with piloted planes thousands of miles away over hostile territory has risk. And one of those risks is that one of those planes has some kind of problem even without being shot down, and the pilot has to eject. And then you've got an even bigger problem. You've got a hostage situation, a prisoner situation that has strategic implications. Look how hard this has been to deal with in the context of Gaza. And so one of the reasons we are luckiest that there haven't been more problems in the context of all of these overflights of vast Iranian territory is that planes have problems all the time. And at some point, if you're mowing the lawn for years and years, the risk of that goes way up to almost a certainty eventually. Anyway.
No, I agree. And the other thing it presupposes is that you have the freedom of movement to get over to Iranian territory. But, as the Middle East has demonstrated a lot in the last 20 years, what governments are going to be in charge in the airspace that you're potentially going to be transiting? And may they be unhappy about your planes going back and forth? In the scenario in which they are unhappy and they say no and they take action to stop you, well, then you got a problem with the Iranians and with others as well. So I think there's all sorts of complications as a long-term solution to this. I think solution needs to be put in air quotes. But the question I was going to come to you with, it actually it points a little bit to this, which is, what do you think the nature of Russia and China's response to all this, right? I think before the conflict, I would have said that the Chinese probably aren't going to get involved, but the Russians might, especially after the changed relationship over Iranian support for Russia over Ukraine. That appears not to have been the case, but Russia clearly wants to have a role in the Middle East. Kind of walk us through how you think the Russians and Chinese looked at this, and what do you think their thinking is long-term for the region?
So I think the short answer is you are going to see very little, but for different reasons. You're going to see very little, already have seen very little from the Russian side, not because I think they wouldn't relish the opportunity to help Iran at least hurt the United States. Keep in mind, all this is happening in the context of Russia probably having suffered more than 1 million battlefield casualties over the course of the last few years, which is like a sentence I can hardly believe I'm saying. And those casualties having been caused, yes, by the bravery and fighting spirit of the Ukrainian military using American weapons. And without any meaningful yet knocking on all kinds of wood, Russian retaliation against the United States or NATO. Would they like a way to help somebody else hurt us? I am sure they would. Do they have the capacity in the current moment when they are massively bogged down to even do so much as send Iran some air defense or other weapon systems that could help them? No, because they need every single one of these things for this very nasty fight that is not going very well that they're in, that is much higher priority to them. So one of the things this has revealed is Russia is not a very selfless, not a very good partner. They saw Assad fall in Syria. They didn't lift a finger. They've now seen Iran dealt this incredibly severe blow and not done anything. And I don't expect that they will. China, totally different calculus. China just never wants to touch these sorts of messy security situations. They have a real material interest here in making sure the oil continues to flow. They're number one, number two, Daniel can tell us, customer probably of Iranian crude alongside the Indians, and also of Saudi crude and everybody else's crude. So they want to make sure there's continues to be the free flow of commerce. But other than that, I mean, as much as they purport to be Iran's friend, they tend not to want to touch messy security situations. They think that is an American conceit. They're perfectly happy to free ride off of American attempts to provide stability in this region. And I don't think are looking to do a heck of a lot more than that, especially, by the way, while they are in the throes of their own pretty high stakes negotiation with Donald Trump. The last thing they need or want is another big irritant with the United States. So I think they will say, let's just calm this all down.
Yeah, I think that all tracks. Hey, Karen, I mean, give us your sense of, how the Gulf states are looking at Russia and China right now, and what their influence is from the other direction.
Yeah, well, I would agree with everything that John said in terms of the way Russia behaved in Syria and really demonstrated they were quite happy to walk away. And I think that probably was an advance warning to Iran in some ways of how Russia would or would not lend support. China is interesting in the Gulf relationship because we are seeing increased trade and investment ties between the Gulf states and China. And the eastward orientation of the Gulf means that, this is their future. And it's not just about oil and gas. It's also about petrochemicals, and it's about renewable energy. And it's about expectations of all kinds of trade flows and being a hub for directions of, the goods that are coming also from Southeast Asia into the Middle East and developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. So that whole kind of project is at risk if the region is in upheaval. But China doesn't do much to secure it. The Gulf states have to do that. And so that just underscores how fragile the region feels right now, and how there's really this fragmentation of the order, and in a sense of, who can be in charge. And Israel in charge doesn't look like a great plan either. So again, this calling for the US to be present in some way, and it will be more and more difficult the more unsettled the Iranian government and its future is. And so we are, the war is not over, and the future of Iran is not known. We could see many changes that I think fall into the category of the asymmetrical warfare, of the usage of tactics which really put more civilians at risk, and are, likely to be not directly attributed to Iran. So the whole region feels less safe unless there can be some sort of containment of Iran as it changes.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so this takes us a little bit back to some of the discussion that we were having about the impact on energy markets that might come from more volatility there. And frankly, this is the question that we got asked by pre-submitted audience questions. It's a question that we've been asked in the Q&A already, but that gives me an opportunity to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. That's how I can see them and put them to our panel here. But question regarding the energy market, Jason, Daniel, moving on, what are the key qualitative and quantitative indicators that we should be monitoring to better assess the spillover effects of this tension on the global energy market? And kind of, what are you looking at as you're trying to pin down, okay, if I see this, that's a signpost for that? Either one of you.
Sure. I would say the question of sanctions right now will matter a lot. So Iran has been exporting 1.7 million barrels per day, mostly to China throughout this period. China actually began to build big inventories of Iranian crude earlier this year when Trump was threatening to impose maximum pressure sanctions as leverage to get to the table before we knew this was going in a kinetic direction. Many in the oil market have actually been expecting a fall off in Iranian exports because they had been expecting a very serious sanctions enforcement effort that now may not come. And so we may actually see a larger surplus in the market in the fourth quarter as OPEC is bringing big volumes back if we don't see the kind of fall off in Iran that many had been expecting. So I think we need to watch what the US really intends to do here with sanctions. Trump has kind of said oil can continue to China. It's not clear what he means by that. Are we going to begin to issue waivers to national security waivers to China or waivers to buyers? Are we going to turn a blind eye to shippers and refiners and everybody in the banks in that chain or not? Does he loosen them in order to entice Iran to the table, in which case we could be having a bigger surplus, and it'll be a real challenge for OPEC, which is and the Saudis who are trying to unwind these really significant unilateral voluntary production cuts they've had if they have to confront that scenario. And at the same time, what if Trump comes to realize it would really be better to have an agreement here to make sure we understand what's going on with the nuclear program when we want something, and Iran is not coming to the table? Does he come back to this maximum pressure leverage? So I would look for everything around there, because that really can have meaningful impacts on flows.
Yeah, it's half a comment, half a question to Daniel, because I think on the supply side, you could see the continued unwinding of cuts, meaning Saudi and OPEC bringing barrels back faster, and seems more likely than not, I think that continues. The scenario you just described, where Iranian barrels remain or even increase, and then presumably some number of U.S. producers, used hedging strategies to lock in some of the higher prices we briefly saw. Maybe that's not a huge number, but directionally, maybe a bit of extra production as well. All of that suggests even more of an oversurplus in the end of the year, and then you're talking about prices coming down further, maybe into the 50s or something.
I mean, that's certainly an expectation in the market. I think it's part of why we rose so quickly at the beginning of this conflict. The market has been positioned bearishly, expecting demand will take a hit from tariffs and reductions in global trade, and OPEC plus is bringing barrels on. And so we had a lot of people who were short oil, and then they had to scramble, and we had a huge short covering rally. I think there is an impulse. Many would like to rebuild that kind of positioning. The irony is that the physical oil markets right now are not telling you that this is an oversupplied market. We have low inventories for refined oil products and crude oil. We've got a very backwardated crude curve, which simply means the market is sending signals that we need barrels now. You should empty inventories, and the fundamental backdrop is actually pretty solid. But this can still be a really meaningful factor as we move through the summer, which is a stronger demand period, and then into looking into the winter.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So we got a question. It was a pre-submitted question, which I really, really like. So I want to put it to all of you, because I think it's something we don't talk about enough. We maybe spend a lot of time talking about markets, and we talk about Europe, we talk about the United States, especially resident in the United States as we are. The question is, what suggestions do you have for a developing country like Vietnam? I think we could add a bunch of other ones too, to weather this fragile energy security environment. If you don't have an SPR, even if you don't have as much of an SPR as you used to have, or if you're looking around and you're dependent on, maybe not as much oil as China, but you are still dependent on energy coming from other places, and you've got conflict way far away from you. What are the kinds of strategies, suggestions, thoughts you would have, both either analytically or maybe even physically, to address this as a problem? Again, I'll toss this ball up.
I mean, it's an excellent question. For me, it ties back to also, what does China conclude here? I mean, if you are an energy importer dependent on hydrocarbons that come from the Middle East, then you want to not be as dependent on hydrocarbons that come from the Middle East. And so for China, which imports a little more from Saudi than it does from Iran, it just says double down. We're going renewables and coal in the power sector. Maybe you need to revive conversations with Russia about importing more gas via pipeline. You need to, on the oil side, somewhere like Brazil starts to look like a really wonderful place. So where is some place that is more geopolitically inert to diversify your crude sources? I think if you're Vietnam, more than China, you look to the United States for crude oil. But clearly, I think if you can electrify transport and reduce demand on liquid fuels, you clearly go in that direction. From a Vietnamese perspective, that means you You might want more crude from the United States, and you want more electric vehicles from China, and you move it with that strategy as quickly as you can.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, in the principles of energy security, where does energy security come from, are largely the same. They just may look different in a world of this new great power rivalry, fragmentation, competition that we're in. But one thing, as I said earlier, countries will seek to do for sure is reduce exposure to volatile global markets and reduce trade in energy. And that means more domestic production. And different countries are positioned differently in terms of the resource they have. But if you're a large hydrocarbon importer, that would point in the direction of more electrification, more domestic sources in Europe. You see rethinking some of the anti-nuclear positions, in part, I think, motivated by these energy security concerns, more renewables. And as Daniel said, if you're in Vietnam or Indonesia, coal. And that may not be consistent with what we're hoping for on the climate agenda, but domestic employment and energy security, I think we will see countries moving in that direction. The big asterisks around this idea that sort of moving towards some of these sources of electrification, renewables, you need storage, solar. We just got back from a Center on Global Energy Policy trip to India, a lot of opportunity for solar. They're also doing a lot with coal. But the concerns in India, which equal or exceed those in the United States about dependence on China for supply chain risk, are very substantial. And so again, in this world of competition, great power rivalry, how do different countries, Pakistan, India, Vietnam, people think differently about whether dependence on China for supply chains, as opposed to the daily flow of oil from the Middle East, products that make or store electricity, is that a problem or not? And I think countries will reach different conclusions there. And then the last thing to say is, ever since I think Winston Churchill observed, security in oil lies in variety and variety alone, countries will seek strategies of diversification. Even in Europe, if they had imported 15 or 20% of their gas from Russia, not 40 or 50, it would have been a pretty different situation to try to cope without Russian gas. And I think countries will try to do that too. And we should remember, even for the US, there's a price to be paid for that. There's kind of an insurance premium. There's a security premium. If you want diversification, it's going to cost something, because it's presumably more costly to produce things in other places or do your refining and processing for critical minerals or whatever else. And we don't quite know yet how much of an insurance premium society or governments are willing to pay for increased energy security.
Thanks. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. If there are any additional questions, please fire them in the Q&A. But actually, we've got a couple of good ones here. So I'm going to combine up two, and then I'm going to come to another one, assuming that something doesn't squeeze in. We kind of talked a little bit about Gulf reactions and Gulf views of Israel. We've talked about China, but I'm going to combine these things up with the two questions that we've got. So if Gulf states, in particular the Saudis or Emiratis or others, are concerned about Israeli military domination within the region, does that create opening in space for cooperation with China? Especially if the United States is seen as completely in the corner of Israel, and the relationship is so strong there. I mean, Karen, talk through a little bit, kind of if that's a factor in where Chinese consideration is of their relationship with both the United States, how they look at Israel. Is this a space where the Chinese have an opportunity, or is it just kind of not really an open space for them at this point?
Well, I think it's very divided between, security needs and economic needs. The United States still provides most of the security needs of the Gulf Arab states. China can't replace that for them. But China is replacing the United States as a trade partner, as an investor. And so this is why there's the tension, right? And this is why people talk about the hedging. But it's sort of an impossibility. And just, as you were talking about sort of the considerations of Vietnam, or countries that are sort of also caught between the US and China in our trade tensions, are also implicated by what happens in the Middle East. Because if you have a real spike in oil and gas prices because of conflict in the region, but you're also, a transshipper of Chinese goods, or perhaps manufacturing Chinese goods and then trying to export them, and your shipping costs go up, and you've got to go around the Cape of Good Hope, et cetera, you're victim to those tensions as well. So I think the Gulf states feel that they kind of have to have this dual approach. I don't think it's in the U.S. interest to continue so much just selling weapons, because ultimately, there will be some sort of alternative or replacement to that. But that's kind of a longer story. There was another question in the chat too that I saw, and now it's gone, so I guess we're not going to answer that one. But it was about the Chinese brokered détente between Israel and Iran.
Yeah.
And so I would just say about that was in March of 2023. And those negotiations had actually started long before, and Iraq had hosted most of those conversations. But China sort of came in and took credit for it at the end. And I don't think that has ever included a stipulation that Saudi Arabia could not also have good relationships with Israel. The détente with Iran was essentially just to open lines of communication, to return the diplomatic presence and the Saudi ambassador to Tehran. And it's been extremely important. Just that there have been ways to communicate, and even if they're not necessarily increased trade ties or investment ties, that was never the point. And I think the relationship with Israel has, larger dimensions.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there was a Houthi element to that too, on top of all that. So we're in our last 50 seconds. The red light's starting to flash, but I've got two questions that to me kind of link up, but maybe I'm not thinking about this right. Question about, upcoming OPEC meeting and how that's going to affect global energy markets. And I think the connection to all this here, but also the question of if oil prices stay down due to bearish events that we've all mentioned, how are shale producers going to react? So, maybe talk a little bit about the connection, OPEC, U.S. production, that sort of thing.
Yes. So starting with OPEC, for the time being, they're kind of on autopilot of bringing back production. There had been a long saga over several years worth of production restraint. There's about 2.2 million barrels per day from 8 OPEC producers who had voluntarily taken it off the market in excess of OPEC requirements, and Saudi basically got tired of carrying the heaviest burden. And so it is bringing those volumes back. About half of that is already on, and they have been signaling they're going to just keep going. I think right now, the physical signals in the oil market are telling you we can absorb these barrels because inventories are low. And so they're going to continue to do that all the way through the summer. They don't have an obstacle to that. If you do spreadsheets with supply-demand balances, that starts to look really oversupplied in the fourth quarter, but that's a problem for later. I would say that if it does look like we have falling prices, the market starts to move into oversupply, then they could decide if they want to pause. But that's, they can adjust on a month-to-month basis. For U.S. production, I mean, basically, WTI has been falling since the start of the year and was in the 50s in early May. And so U.S. producers who have been taking down rigs, and mostly this has caused a deterioration in the outlook for U.S. supply. We're only expecting about a total U.S. growth of 100,000 barrels per day this year. I think this spike in prices during the crisis was just a great opportunity for producers to kind of bank some money by hedging better prices, but they're not going to increase production. Maybe they don't need to cut production or rigs as much as they had. They'll just fortify their balance sheets and wait to see what happens.
Jason, Karen, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think that's a great summary.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time here today and for sharing your insights on the situation as it's unfolded over the last few weeks. For those of you in attendance today, and we've kept the vast majority of you, so thanks for coming with us to the end. Please continue to follow along with the Center on Global Energy Policy Institute of Global Politics at Columbia University SIPA in the coming weeks. And please be on the lookout for potential webinars on this topic in the future. So thanks again for joining us. Appreciate everybody's joining us.